When you're lost in the forest, stand still. When you're lost in the forest, stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. You must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask its permission to be known and to know it. Listen, the forest breathes. It whispers, I have made this place around you. You may leave and return to here. No two trees are the same to a raven. No two branches are the same to a wren. If what a tree or a branch does is lost on you, well, now then you are surely lost. What do you do when you're lost in the forest? Stand still. The forest will find you. That's David Wagoner, who teaches at the University of Washington, writing about Native American instructions to their children in the very, very wet Olympic Peninsula. I just love that. What do you do when you're lost in the forest? Stand still. Let the forest find you. So the four of us discovered that we were asked to do this panel, and we just assumed that there was someone who was leading the panel. And then when we arrived here at the front, we discovered that lost is a place too. And so what we're going to do is each one of us is going to talk for about 5 minutes about what we happen to be working on right now. That was Brian's idea. And I will be kind of pointing in the direction of people to do that, which was my idea. And we're going to start with Sarah because I told her we were going to start with her.
She came up with that on the fly, I think, so kudos. And also, thank you for not making me moderate. I'm going to hold this. Thank you for not making me moderate. I am a journalist, and I moderate lots of things, but I don't like to do it off the cuff, so I'm going to just talk. I'm Sarah McCammon. I am a national political correspondent at NPR, and I'm the author of The Evangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, which is part memoir, part reporting. I was here a couple of hours ago. Some of you were here as well, so sorry for those of you who've heard some of this before, but we'll have a different conversation as a group. In short, my book is about my own journey out of evangelicalism, and it's kind of intertwined with the stories of other people I interviewed. You know, as a journalist, I love to tell other people's stories. That's what I do for a living. That's what excites me. And, you know, I had this kind of weird experience of covering the 2016 campaign, writing a lot about evangelicals while also, you know, having a deep, deep history with that movement. And so the book sort of grew out of those experiences and out of my desire to connect with other people who had walked a similar path. So that book came out earlier this year in March. It's available here. And what's really taking up a lot of my time today is this election thing that we have going on. So I will be heading straight from here tomorrow to Milwaukee for one of the conventions, and then there's another one in Chicago next month. So it's a very, very busy time. We're back in the thick of election season, and this has been such a wonderful respite from all of that. It's been I've just been here a few hours, and I've heard such good things about this event, and I see why now. What an amazing group of people. So look forward to the conversation.
That's your microphone.
My mic. I'm so in the habit.
See, this is something, you discover things when you transition genders from one to the other. And one of the things is that women are taught worldwide to apologize for themselves. First of all, I cannot tell you how much more often I say I'm sorry than I did when I was a guy, or how rarely I said I'm sorry when I was a guy. And then once you've spent, 10 years or so as a woman, you just give your microphone away. Because it's expected of you. So, I have learned these things. Yeah, I was just telling folks Wednesday night, I ran into some troubles a couple of years ago, and I told my former wife, who I'm still close to, we're both therapists and we still work together, I said, I'm a fundamentally different person as Paula than I was as Paul. And I said, and apparently a lot of it is not good because I'm having all kinds of people tell me these things that are wrong with me that weren't there when I was Paul. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry, dear. You just got a free pass as Paul because powerful white guys get a free pass. Women do not, and particularly do not get a free pass from other women. You, in fact, have had these same abiding flaws for the 50 years I have known you. So speaking next for us is going to be Brian McLaren.
I'm sorry. I've never felt so sincere in saying those words. Well, first, Sarah, can I just say I'm so happy to meet you, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being a journalist.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just feel so many things are threatened species these days, and journalists, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm guessing we have so fewer journalists in the world today than we did 10 or 20 or more years ago. And we're finding out how much we have lost by not having more people out there saying that unless people are trying to tell the truth and tell stories, we, in a certain sense, make it very easy for people to lie and get away with it. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for writing your book, too, and telling your personal story. Because I imagine there's vulnerability in telling your own story that goes beyond the challenge of telling other people's stories, so thank you. I gave a talk this morning, so I won't say anything about that. I am interested. I have a diagnosis of those of us who are in the religious world. And by the way, I also grew up evangelical, but I've come to see that the problems in evangelicalism are not unique, that there's a Catholic version of them, and there is a Mormon version of them. And I have rabbi friends now. I was on the phone with one of them recently, and she told me that every day since October 7th has been a more agonizing day than any day she had in her life before October 7th, because she not only now watches her religion be a victim, but watches her religion be a victimizer, and she watches her fellow Jews not know how to process the moral complexity that their identity holds. I was on a call. I wasn't on a call. I was visiting my daughter who lives in Iowa, who's a professor, and one of her fellow professors who has become a good friend is a Hindu, and we were having dinner a couple months ago, and he said to me, living in Iowa is like living in a lot of the country. He lives in Iowa City, which is a very little blue area where he always feels safe and accepted and welcome. But there's a certain number of miles outside of Iowa City where he goes, and he's seen as a foreigner and all the rest, and he sees the flags and all the rest. He said, I never thought in my life I would call my parents in India and feel that they're more like the people in rural Iowa than they are like me, because they have a kind of Hindu nationalism that's going on that's turning them into very, very similar people to Christian nationalists here in this country. And we could expand that story farther and farther. But I, as a person with Christian identity, I feel this sense that many people, the way they solve the problem of Christian identity is they leave the Christian part of their identity, which if you do that is fine. I have no quarrels. I understand. I wrote a book called Do I Stay Christian? So I sort of understand that. But here's the problem. If everybody who has, let's say, a broader framework and a deeper conscience about issues leaves their religion to the fundamentalists, in a certain sense, everybody who leaves has more problems from all the other people who are staying in all the different religions. Because we kind of can predict what the world looks like if all of our religions only have a fundamentalist pole. Does that make sense? So the work of figuring out what it means to be a non-fundamentalist Christian or a non-fundamentalist Jew or a non-fundamentalist Muslim suddenly to me becomes important work. And the same thing will be for people who are secular, whether they identify as atheists, agnostic, spiritual, but not religious. They're going to have to model a way of being human that is new and different. And so the last thing I'll say is one of the things I'm really interested in, I came a day early to be part of 2 of the pre-conference workshops, which, by the way, if you've never tried, next year you might really enjoy. And they say something about what I'm concerned about right now. In the morning, I was part of the Convergence Music Project workshop, which is for songwriters and liturgists and worship leaders who are trying to imagine what kind of songs could we sing when we gather that don't make us feel better than them, and that make us feel our solidarity with them. What kinds of songs could we sing that don't make us think that up is good and down here is bad, but rather imagine down here being good and sacred and valuable? Does that make sense? What kind of songs do we need to sing that would strengthen our desires for peace and to love the earth and to love each other and to love our enemies, things that the future of the world depends on? So that's how I spent the morning yesterday. And in the afternoon, I had the privilege of being with Lead Now, which is for seminarians and first call pastors who are in the trenches doing that sort of work too. And so all of you who are involved in that kind of creative work, I'm super interested in that and glad for your creative work, and it all counts and it all matters. So thank you very much. I'm sorry.
So the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes. The first one was in showing that the key social unit for the human species is not the nuclear family, as had been assumed, but it is in fact the tribe. And his second Pulitzer Prize was on identifying 9 tribal species. He calls them eusocial species, E-U-S-O-C-I-A-L. And he said 8 of the 9 evolved, and as you would expect, an enemy comes into the camp, the tribe unites, defeats the enemy, life goes on. He said the 9th eusocial species has unfortunately evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe's survival. And where no natural enemy exists, they create one. And he said, not long before his death, if we don't get a hold of that, we lose the species and we lose the planet as we know it. He also said that among the most egregious problem creators of all that would be the fundamentalist forms of the 3 desert religions. The 3 desert religions began in the desert, so understandably began as religions of scarcity. And in their more generous forms are no longer religions of scarcity. People miss the fact that 52% of Christians are supportive of marriage equality, for instance, in the United States. Because the noise is being made by the fundamentalist expressions of the 3 desert religions, which remain religions of scarcity. And yes, that informs what's happening in Gaza. It informs what's happening throughout the Middle East. And it very much informs what's happening in the United States. And there are those who are writing in a way to help people out of that environment into an environment that is no longer focused on scarcity, but is focused on possibility, is focused on hope. And Sheri Pallas is one of those people, and she has a book she will be debuting tomorrow that talks about that.
Yeah, I've heard lots of it. Hi, everyone. Should I apologize? Sorry for not having the mic handy. I am Reverend Dr. Sheri Pallas. Oh, see, I can't even. Okay. I host a weekly live stream called Fireside Creators. It's on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, or X, where we try to change the world with a conversation each week. My book, We Have Ruined God, My Journey Out of Religion and Into Unconditional Love, was released May 9th. It was a 13-year journey. When the church came after my grandson, I kind of went crazy. I wrote my first and only complaint letter to the church and said, how dare you judge my grandson? How dare you isolate him? He wasn't even a year old, and they refused to pray for him because he was born in sin. So I took a journey over the last 13 years and really built the Deconstruction manual, per se. It walks through all of the texts that add division, supremacy, moral supremacy, racial supremacy, all of those things. And the conclusion that I came to is not just a cliche, but the reality that God is the energy of love. And either we tap into it or we don't. And using that love is what changes the world. And so if we can embody that, drop some dogma, drop some doctrine, unless it teaches us how to love better, how to love our neighbor better, I have no need for it. It's just to love. And I think that is how I follow Jesus. It's how I follow the other sages and how I love my neighbor. And I've got some really weird neighbors. So I think the universe put me into this position to test me to see if I actually love my neighbor. Woo, it's hard. Especially driving. I have road rage really hard. But I practice and I do it. And so my thing is love is my religion, peace is my intention, and social justice is my goal. I never want another generation to go through what I went through. It was traumatic. In fact, there probably should be a trigger warning in the beginning of my book because it was pretty bad. But then it goes on to give you a lesson and a journey of love in yourself and how to do all of that. So I hope you guys all read it. If you don't, just join our book club anyway. But I hope to change the world, no big deal or anything. But hope to instill more love in everyone's life.
So it's been my honor and privilege to do 3 TED Talks that have had about 10 million views. And because of that, I get to speak at corporations, universities, government institutions all over the world, primarily on the issue of gender equity. And I love talking on that subject, and kind of traditionally I'll do a 30-minute speech, and then after that 30-minute speech, I do 30 minutes of Q&A, sometimes 45 minutes of Q&A. And it's been interesting for me in the last year that it does not take long for the Q&A to move away from gender equity to the subject that I'm not there to talk about. Religion in America, because they know I am still a pastor, and what's happening with the transgender population in America. So that is in fact taking up a lot of my time. Last year, there were 592 anti-transgender laws introduced in state legislatures throughout the United States. 90 were signed into law in 30 different states. If you're transgender, it's not a really good time to be an American. So this year, I had signed contracts with my speakers agency for Carnegie Mellon University, University of Michigan, a Discover Card, a women's conference in Las Vegas. All 4 of those were canceled at the last minute because those in charge said, no transgender speakers. That's not happened to me in the last 5 years or so. I still have spoken plenty of times this year. I'm not destitute, but that is quite the shock. So people always ask, well, it's the damn Republicans. They're the ones driving these anti-transgender laws. And the truth of the matter is, it is Republican legislatures, but it's not Republicans per se. 2 good studies done at the end of the 2020 election as people left their polling places asked Republicans, Donald Trump voters, not Republicans, but asked Donald Trump voters, should transgender people have the same civil rights as everyone else? Both studies, one by NBC and Marist, one by Pew Research, both studies, 61% of Republicans said transgender people should have the same civil rights as everybody else. So who then?
Say that number again.
61%. 6-1. 6 out of 10 Republicans believe that transgender people should have the same civil rights as anybody else. So who then is driving these laws? Evangelical Christians. 87% of whom believe that gender is immutably determined at birth. 67% of whom believe that we already give too many civil rights to transgender people. That number is up 6 points in just 3 years. And yet only 31% who actually know someone who is out as a transgender person. So I'm convinced that the only way we can shift that is through proximity and narrative. We are a narrative-based species. You don't sleep without dreaming, and you do not dream in mathematical equations. You dream in stories. Actually, I correct that. I spoke at Spirit Aerospace this year. They're the people who make the fuselage for the 787 and the 737 MAX, apparently badly. But I was saying that to them, and actually it was about 500 engineers, and a number of them do dream in mathematical equations. So I stand corrected. Most of us dream in stories. We are a narrative-based species. Always have been, always will be. How did we move so quickly when we move so slowly on issues of racial equity? How did we move so quickly on marriage equality? Well, Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind says, people do change their minds, but not unless information comes to them in a non-threatening way. What is less threatening than comedic, long-form storytelling? So how did we get here with marriage equality? I think it started in the 1970s with Norman Lear and All in the Family, introducing a subject in our own homes, on our boxy television screens, bringing, for the first time, gay people into our lives. From there, it moves to the scripted Ellen show, not the talk show, the scripted show, where the protagonist comes out as a gay woman. From there, it goes to Will and Grace, where the showrunners of that particular program wanted to focus on the concepts of Will and Grace, and so they named the characters Will and Grace. From there, you go to Modern Family, where one of 3 major storylines is, in fact, a gay storyline. And then you go to today, where people are incidentally gay. We've seen that shift. I believe Hollywood has had a lot to do with it, because all of those stories, long-form story, coming into our homes in a non-threatening way, on television, through comedy. We have not had that with the trans community. We had Transparent, didn't help us. Pose didn't really help us. We need the same thing in that world. There's a Hollywood production company that has my life rights, which does sound Faustian, I do understand that. But their idea is to do a 3-season, 10 shows per season, so 30-show arc on my life. The first season is already arced out. The outline is there for it, and the very first show has already been written. But guess what? In today's world, no one wants to fund it. I am not optimistic that it's going to get funded. But I am convinced it's proximity and narrative that's going to get us there. So I get paid a hell of a lot of money to speak at corporations and universities all over the world. I go to Christian universities pro bono. I do tell them that they don't get to control what I'm going to say. They're going to have to trust me. But I figure if I can get in front of those kids, then those kids have to see, oh my God, she seems relatively normal or abnormal at the level that I am. Relatively normal or abnormal. And of course, that's half the battle. So a good bit of what I'm doing this year is shifting from focusing quite so much on gender equity to focusing more on trans issues in a way that just puts my humanity in front of other people. I'm also focused a little more on a subject that Stan and I are going to be talking about at 4 o'clock tomorrow. I think Carrie is going to join us on that as well. And that is, my son and I are putting together another TED Talk. I coach for TED, so we're kind of in the catbird seat there. And so TED, kind of like most secular organizations, does not think religion exists. They're pretty sure it's been gone for 1,000 years or so. And so we're actually pitching a talk next year on why religion is good for the species. Because it is. Because we did not take off as a species when we stayed at the level of blood kin. We did not take off as a species until we became a tribal species. Again, the work of E.O. Wilson. What brought us together as tribes? Most people assume it was our need for safety. It was not. What brought us together as tribes was man's search for meaning. What brought us together as tribes, think Stonehenge. Think the carved bodies of Rapa Nui or burial mounds of indigenous Americans. We have always figured out the meaning of life in community. And I'm convinced there is a strong future for religion. So that's what the four of us are working on. Now you get to ask any of us questions about what we're working on or other things we know nothing about, but you just feel like asking. I will repeat the questions, and yes, sir, you're the first. So the question is one that I think a lot of us have had. Thank you so much for that. And that is, a lot of people who claim to be evangelicals are not, in fact, Christians. So has the term been co-opted? And what does it mean? Is that a fair representation of your question?
Somewhat, but it's also, my concern is that at the same time churches are dying.
At the same time, churches are dying.
Right, churches are dying, and so my question is, my concern is Christian nationalism could become the religion of America, if you know what I mean?
Okay.
And people won't need to go to church because they're getting it everywhere.
So yeah, 70% of Americans identified with a local religious body in 1999. That was down to 47% in 2021. Pretty precipitous drop. So is Christian nationalism becoming the new religion of America? More accurate. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Sarah?
I don't know. I mean, I think that would, the question I would have about that idea, it's an interesting one, is how do people express that? Is it simply by voting? Is it by going to political events? And to what extent does being a Christian nationalist, I mean, replace traditional religion? I mean, I guess I can't really answer those questions, but I can point to a couple of pieces of data. True, religion, as I think we all know, is on the decline in the U.S. And when we say religion, we mostly mean Christianity because it's by far the largest religion still. The trends for other religions are a little more mixed, but Christianity is resoundingly on the decline, pretty much across the board. There's some data from the Pew Research Center from, I believe, 2021 that indicated that it was a tiny bit of movement, and it was a small data, or it was one data set. So I would reserve judgment on this, but there seemed to be some indications that people who were not particularly religious but were white were more likely to newly identify as evangelical because of an affinity with right-wing politics. So that's one interesting data point. But more recently, there's been some additional survey data from Pew, which I would point to this sociologist, Sam Perry at the University of Oklahoma. He's done some good work on this on Twitter, X, and elsewhere, that suggests that while, yes, there are people identifying with sort of Christian nationalist ideas who are not church attenders, there was sort of a myth that evangelicals who were more devout were less likely to embrace Trumpist politics, that those who went to church were less, had less affinity with sort of Trumpism. And that does not appear to be true based on the latest data. So yes, there are people who are not really going to church who are aligning with that movement, but regular church attenders of white evangelical churches are still much more overwhelmingly likely to support Trump than not.
May I add? I would also question all of the polls for the last 4 political cycles. Is this on? For the last 4 political cycles, the polling has been off. If it hadn't been, Hillary would have been president. There would have been a giant red wave, which I still think is a disgusting term, but there would have been a giant red wave that they predicted. The polls have been wrong for the last 4 polling cycles. So keep that in mind. Just question them more. Don't rely on them as much. The polling structure hasn't caught up to our technology. So if we rely on them, I think we will be misguided.
Brian, do you want to respond to that?
The question about will Christian nationalism become a sort of de facto religion, I think that's an insightful question, because what it suggests is, Paula referred to Viktor Frankl's groundbreaking book, Man's Search for Meaning. If people are seeking for meaning, and if religion has ruined God, and people are seeking for meaning in some other place, a political party can offer meaning at a very, very low cost. Once of every 4 years is your cost, and it takes about an hour. And not only that, but it provides you what you used to have to listen to religious broadcasting to get inspiration and fired up. Now you have 24-hour radio and television stations and unending websites that provide all of the same hits and reinforcements for that kind of vision. So I just think one way to say this is, it's a bit of a cliche, but if you don't have a healthy form of religion or spirituality, you will have unhealthy forms that fill the gap. And this is and there will always be autocratic leaders who know how to trawl for support. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely inevitable. And this is where we all better wake up. Yeah, so for what it's worth.
So other questions over here, and wait for the microphone if you don't mind, because apparently I do not have the gift of rephrasing questions accurately.
I think the question this gentleman asked earlier, we only have to look back to 1932 to determine how a politician can recouch religion. And Bonhoeffer did a masterful job of trying to warn us and warn his constituents, where I'm afraid he lost the cause with his death.
People have questions you want to ask anybody on the panel. So any questions you want to ask?
Well, I'll say something, if I could just react to that briefly. Something I think about a lot and sometimes talk about is the importance of being honest, in order to sort of understand where we are in history, being honest about where we've been as the church or religious people. And something I think about a lot is how much growing up evangelical I was taught about Bonhoeffer, people like Corrie ten Boom, the Dutch resistance worker. I was taught almost nothing about the Christians who enabled the Nazis. That part of the story wasn't told. And I think that is just like one example of sometimes when we miss the whole story. This is why we repeat history, because we don't really know history sometimes.
Yeah, we have a question right there in the red shirt. If we can go there. And then to you in the back with the blue hat.
Yeah, this is for Sarah. When you go to the rallies like you're going to do and also the conventions, what have you noticed about the people who are in minorities that are voting for Trump and African Americans and Hispanics that are moving there, particularly black men and I guess Hispanic men? Is there a macho? Is there, and just generally and to that gender thing?
I can sort of address that in a couple of ways. I should say, first of all, that I just went to my first Trump rally in several years about a month ago. I had been covering other issues, and then I primarily, during the primary, covered the Nikki Haley campaign. But there is some really interesting data that suggests that young black men and young Latino men are moving to the right, moving toward Trump in greater numbers than, certainly if you look generationally, there's a gap there. I'm not sure what to attribute it to entirely. The rally that I went to, this is one rally, was still overwhelmingly white, the people in attendance, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. I did talk to one couple who were, they were not black or Latino, they were immigrants from Indonesia, but what they said to me was that they are frustrated when they look at the border. They see, this is a man and a woman, they see an immigration situation that alarms them, and they feel they spent many years trying to come into the country legally, and they feel that the current situation is unfair and unstable. That's just one anecdote that I can think of.
Can I address that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of cruelty to migrants? And we're really back at that point right now. I mean, it wasn't over homosexuality, it was because of cruelty to migrants. So when we hear these border calls and this fear over the border, I think we have to do a lot of education to quell those fears and welcome our neighbors and love them.
So back there, if you can stand, and then we're going to come to you right here. Oh, okay, you have to go. Oh, sorry. We'll come to you next.
This is just an open question to all of you. What do you see that gives you the most hope for the future for the progressive Christian tradition? And secondly, why aren't we seeing more of that kind of nationally? Documentaries or just something that's talking about good news on the progressive Christian front?
Brian, I'll go to you first on that, since you talked about that last night as we began.
I have no idea what I said last night. Well, let me say something about it, but I don't remember what I was saying about it last night. So the first thing, this will be a back door way of answering that question. I have become very interested in authoritarianism and how authoritarianism works. And to me, the authoritarianism on the social level and bias on the individual level, to me, are two elements of a much bigger equation, but they're important elements. And after World War II, there was a huge amount of research on authoritarianism. Oh my goodness, I'm having one of those moments. A Canadian sociologist, oh my goodness. No, this is back in the 50s, 60s. I think he might still be alive, but at any rate, forgive me, I'm having a senior
It's
moment.
hot.
Yeah, I don't need heat as an excuse. This happens all the time. At any rate, he did a bunch of research and came up with a term called the authoritarian personality. And what he basically found is that about 30% of every culture, you could ask them a set of survey questions, and about 30%, if they were exposed to a level of stress, they would prefer to have a strong man come in and take control and solve problems. And it seemed to be related to stress, shame, things like this. And it was tested in a lot of different places. And the world wasn't polarized enough to say you can't do that sort of study or say that kind of study. And then in the 60s, and that expanded to study the differences between right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism, because in the 20th century, there was a lot of both. And here was one of the findings. Right-wing authoritarians primarily work by identifying an enemy and mobilizing people against the enemy. Interestingly, the enemy doesn't need to exist. The enemy can be completely imaginary, but because there are people, a characteristic of an authoritarian personality is that if they feel shame for some reason, they need to get the shame off of them. And if you offer them an enemy upon whom to project their shame, the enemy doesn't need to exist, but the emotion of purging the energy, the shame on the enemy does the job. Does that make sense? Left-wing authoritarians usually come to power by making promises. If you give me all of the power, I will give you this, this, and this. The problem with left-wing authoritarians is if they don't deliver on the promises, then the people withdraw support for the authoritarian. Does that make sense? So left-wing, here's the thing that you can look in history and see this. People often come to power with left-wing authoritarianism. Once they gain power, they switch and become right-wing authoritarians and create enemies. You can find several very interesting examples of that in history. But what it means is left-wing authoritarianism is inherently more fragile. And now I forgot the question.
What gives you hope?
What gives you hope going future,
Thank you.
going into the
Thank
future?
you. Thank you. So, here's the thing.
I'm 5 years older than he is. I'm just saying.
I don't know, I'm feeling pretty bad today. In fact, I feel I should give up my space on this panel. No. So what I think, we're in this interesting situation where authoritarianism is springing up all around the world, and I think some places are going to try it. I mean, it's inevitable. Some places they will win, and then what other people are going to see is how is that working out for you, to have that kind of a system. So, I just feel like there is some inevitability in here, and these things run their course. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, both France narrowly and Britain soundly have votes where they turned against the people who were promising revenge on enemies and the singling out of enemies. So we'll see if that happens here.
So when I look at René Girard's work, Violence and the Sacred and Mimetic Theory, one of the things that I find interesting in all that is that he identified that those in power discovered the best way to remain in power is to identify enemies within the camp that only they could identify and eradicate from the camp. And so you better not turn me out of power. But in all of his work, he was fascinated to find that there was one meta-narrative that was not the meta-narrative of the victor, one meta-narrative that was not the meta-narrative of the winner. It was the meta-narrative of the oppressed. It was the Jesus meta-narrative. And I just found it really interesting that while he wasn't particularly impressed with Christianity as a religion, that he was very impressed with the meta-narrative of Jesus. And that to me gives me hope. It also gives me a hope as a Christian, because I'm convinced that that is the meta-narrative of the oppressed that will get us there. Sheri?
Well, and that's a perfect segue to me, because I think that I am just absolutely amazed at the commonalities and similarities to our time and Jesus' time. And I use that as a guide, because he too was fighting political power. He too was fighting people who were using greed. And while I no longer title myself a Christian, I like to say that Jesus is still my main guy, but I get around. But in these times, he gives us a really good model where we can say, no, do not reject the migrants. Do not reject the other religions. Love your neighbor. And I think if we keep that in focus, all of us will have hope in that.
Sarah.
I think the question was about what gives me hope about progressive Christianity, and I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I will just generally point to one thing that gives me hope, which is I think sometimes progress in general happens so slowly, and there are false starts, and we can't see it, and we get discouraged, understandably. But I just look at my own children, and I realize that, I see the world they're living in and the things that they understand that I didn't, and that gives me hope. And one of my favorite stories about this is for totally nonpartisan reasons, honestly, I need to say this as a journalist. In 2016, both of my kids were very little. They were 5 and 9, and they were very pro Hillary Clinton. And we didn't really talk to them about politics. The only reason why, because all they understood was that there had never been a girl and there needed to be a girl. And one of them, those little placemats they show kids with all the presidents' faces in black and white around the edges. One of them, was looking at it and was so confused. I think he pointed to Patrick Henry, who had the long wig, and he was like, "That must be the girl, right? There must be a girl." And I'm like, "No, sweetie, that's not." And he's like, "Where are the girls?" And I was like, "There just never have been." And both of my sons were just like, "How? How is that possible?" And the fact that my sons, both boys, were growing up in a world where it was inconceivable to them that women hadn't been in leadership in our country was really moving to me, and it made me think, you know what? In their minds, women are just as good as men. Women can do everything men can do, and eventually it will happen. And I don't mean that as a partisan statement, but it's just their vantage point looks different than ours.
So our time is up. I want to thank you for attending our very well-planned session.